The Grand Hall of the Intergalactic Military Academy was a marvel of engineering and history, a place that seemed to carry the weight of centuries in its soaring arches and crystalline walls. Every corner of the chamber gleamed under the pale artificial starlight that filtered through the transparent dome above. It was here, beneath the awe-inspiring expanse of the galaxy, that the ceremonial armor of the Zorathian warriors stood, a relic of an era long past, yet still shrouded in mystery and reverence. The armor was unlike anything crafted in modern times. Towering and imposing, its black and silver plating seemed almost alive, faintly pulsing with an inner light that shifted colors like a restless tide. Its chest bore the emblem of the Zorathian Empire, a symbol of unity and strength, flanked by intricate carvings that told the story of countless victories. The helmet, with its angular visor, seemed to watch over the hall with a silent authority, a reminder of the greatness it had once served. For generations, the armor had stood as a challenge and a mystery. It was said to possess an intelligence of its own, an ancient AI designed to judge the worthiness of those who dared to wear it. The Academy's students, a mix of species from across the galaxy, often gathered in hushed groups to marvel at the artifact. Some spoke of its legendary origins, claiming it had been forged in the heart of a dying star. Others whispered that the armor had a soul, one that sought only the most exceptional of beings to wield its power. But these stories were little more than folklore to David Carter, a human cadet who had only recently joined the Academy. To him, the armor was just another reminder of how out of place he felt among the galaxy's finest. David stood at the far end of the hall, a broom in hand, sweeping the polished floor with slow, deliberate movements. He had been assigned cleaning duty after a minor infraction. Nothing serious, just a poorly timed comment during a tactical exercise that had earned him the ire of his instructor. It wasn't the first time he had found himself on the wrong side of the Academy's rigid discipline, and he doubted it would be the last. Humans were a rare sight at the Intergalactic Military Academy, and David often felt the weight of his species' reputation pressing down on him. To the other cadets, he was a curiosity at best and an annoyance at worst. A representative of a backwater world with little to offer the galaxy. As he worked, his gaze kept drifting toward the armor. It was hard to ignore, even for someone as jaded as David. The way it seemed to hum softly in the silence of the hall, the way its light shifted ever so slightly when no one was looking. It was as if the armor was alive, watching, waiting. David couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity. What would it feel like to wear something so powerful, be chosen by something that had rejected countless others? The thought was as thrilling as it was absurd. He shook his head, dismissing the idea. A human being chosen by the armor? It was laughable. Still, the allure of the armor was hard to resist. David found himself sweeping closer and closer to the pedestal where it stood, each pass of his broom bringing him nearer. The hall was empty, the other cadets having long since retired for the evening. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the faint echo of his footsteps and the soft swish of the broom against the floor. Before he knew it, he was standing directly in front of the armor, the broom forgotten in his hand. Up close, the armor was even more impressive. The carvings on its surface seemed to shift and flow like liquid, forming patterns that defied comprehension. The light emanating from its core was warm and steady, pulsing in time with an unseen rhythm. David hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he shouldn't be this close. There were strict rules about interacting with the relics in the hall, but something about the armor called to him, a quiet, insistent whisper that tugged at the edges of his mind. Before he could stop himself, David reached out, his hand hovering just above the armor's chest plate. The metal was cool to the touch, and for a moment nothing happened. He exhaled, a mix of relief and disappointment washing over him. Of course nothing would happen. The armor had remained dormant for centuries, untouched by even the most worthy of beings. Why would it react to him, a human cadet with no remarkable qualities? And then the impossible happened. The armor began to glow, its inner light intensifying until the entire hall was bathed in its radiance. The carvings on its surface came alive, shifting and reconfiguring in a dazzling display of color and motion. David stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock as the armor began to move. The pedestal that had held it for so long disintegrated into dust, and the armor's voice, deep and resonant, filled the hall. "You have been chosen," it declared, its tone both ancient and commanding. David could only stare in stunned silence as the armor enveloped him, piece by piece. The chest plate secured itself around his torso, the gauntlet slid over his hands, and the helmet lowered itself onto his head. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Warm, comforting, and exhilarating all at once. The armor seemed to merge with his very being, amplifying his senses and filling him with a strength he had never known. As the light faded, David found himself standing in the center of the hall, clad in the legendary armor. He raised a hand, marveling at the way the metal responded to his movements, as if it were an extension of his own body. The hall, once silent, was now alive with the sound of approaching footsteps. The alarm had been triggered, and soon the room would be filled with instructors and cadets, all eager to see what had caused the disturbance. David's mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. The armor had chosen him, a human, the least likely candidate in the entire academy. What did it mean? Why now? And, most importantly, what would happen next? For the first time since arriving at the academy, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was more than what everyone thought he was. Perhaps he was destined for something greater. David Carter stood in the center of the ceremonial hall, the weight of the legendary armor pressing against his body, though it felt strangely natural, as if it had been designed with him in mind. The glowing carvings on the armor's surface pulsed faintly, casting a soft, ever-shifting light against the crystalline walls. His mind reeled with a torrent of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a growing sense of fear. He had no idea how or why this was happening. The only thing he knew for certain was that the once dormant armor had come alive, and it had chosen him. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the far end of the hall. The alarms had drawn the attention of instructors and cadets alike, and now a small crowd was forming just beyond the main entrance. Their silhouettes flickered in the faint glow of the hall's lighting as they hesitated, unsure of what they were about to witness. Slowly they began to trickle in, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief as they caught sight of David. Whispers rippled through the group, growing louder with each passing moment. "Is that the armor?" A Gorothian cadet murmured, his voice tinged with awe. "But it hasn't activated for centuries," another exclaimed, this one from a sleek amphibious species whose wide eyes reflected the light of the armor. David felt his stomach churn as the crowd's attention fixed on him. He wanted to explain, to tell them that this was all some kind of mistake, but the words caught in his throat. His hands clenched into fists as he tried to calm the rapid thumping of his heart. The armor's inner systems hummed softly, almost reassuringly, as if sensing his distress. Despite his growing panic, he couldn't help but notice how seamlessly the armor moved with him, how natural it felt to wear. It was as if it had been waiting for him all along. General Zorath entered the hall with an air of authority that immediately silenced the crowd. Towering and broad-shouldered, the Zorathian general was a figure of both respect and intimidation, his metallic blue skin shimmering under the dome's light. His piercing gaze swept across the room before settling on David. For a moment he said nothing, his expression unreadable. "What is the meaning of this?" Zorath's voice boomed, cutting through the heavy silence. He stepped closer, his sharp features taut with tension. "Cadet Carter, explain yourself. What have you done?" David swallowed hard, his mouth dry. I didn't do anything, sir," he stammered. "I was just cleaning the hall, and then—" He gestured helplessly at the armor, the words failing him. It just happened. Just happened? Zorath's tone was incredulous, his brow furrowing. The armor of the Zorathian warriors does not simply happen. It is bound by ancient protocols, designed to activate only for the most worthy. For centuries, the greatest minds and warriors of the galaxy have tried and failed to awaken it. And yet, you, a human, stand before us where... The general's words sent another ripple of murmurs through the crowd. David felt the heat of their stares, the weight of their skepticism. He wanted to disappear, to shrink into the armor and escape their judgment. But the armor seemed to have other plans. The carvings on its surface began to glow brighter, the light spreading outward in a radiant display that filled the hall. The whispers stopped as the crowd watched in stunned silence. Then, to everyone's astonishment, a voice emerged. Not from David, but from the armor itself. Deep and resonant, it carried a sense of ancient wisdom, as if it had witnessed countless lifetimes. "This one is worthy," it declared, the words reverberating through the chamber. "The trials of the past hold no relevance. The future demands adaptability, resilience, and unity. These qualities reside within this bearer." The crowd froze, their disbelief etched into every face. Even General Zorath, who had seen more than most, appeared momentarily at a loss for words. He opened his mouth to respond, but the armor spoke. "The time of waiting is over," it continued. "The galaxy stands on the brink of change. This bearer shall serve as the bridge between what was and what will be." David could barely process what he was hearing. The armor, this ancient relic, was speaking directly to him and everyone present, as though it possessed a consciousness of its own. He wanted to deny it, to insist that he was no hero, but the words carried a conviction that was impossible to ignore. He felt a strange mix of fear and responsibility settling over him, the weight of expectations he hadn't asked for. General Zorath finally found his voice, his tone sharp and commanding. "This changes nothing," he said, addressing both the crowd and the armor. "We are an institution of discipline and order. If the armor has chosen this cadet, then he must prove himself worthy through action, not words. The Academy has no place for sentiment." Turning his gaze back to David, Zorath's eyes narrowed. "Cadet Carter, you will undergo a series of tests to determine the extent of your abilities and the validity of this event. Until then, you remain under close observation. Do you understand?" David nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He didn't know what these tests would entail, but he had no choice but to comply. The alternative, being cast out of the academy, or worse, was unthinkable. As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with speculation, David felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Taryn, a fellow cadet from a feline-like species with sleek silver fur and sharp golden eyes. She had always been one of the few who treated him with something approaching kindness. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her ears twitching slightly as she glanced at the armor. "That was intense." David managed a weak smile. "I don't know," he admitted. "I feel like I've just been thrown into the deep end of the galaxy's biggest pool." Taryn chuckled, though her expression remained serious. "Well, if anyone can handle it, it's you. Just don't let Zorath intimidate you. He's all bark and no bite." David appreciated the gesture, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far larger than he could comprehend. As he left the hall, the armor still humming softly around him, he couldn't help but wonder. Why had it chosen him? What did it mean to be worthy in the eyes of something so ancient? And most importantly, what would the future demand of him now that he had been thrust into a role he never sought? And if he were put in direct activity with them, what promises did he have to withhold? As the doors to the hall closed behind him, David felt the weight of the galaxy pressing down on his shoulders. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a small spark of determination began to grow. If the armor believed in him, David stood on the edge of the Academy's vast training grounds, the weight of the ancient armor pressing against his body. Though the metal felt light and natural to his movements, the pressure of the moment was anything but. The tests that General Zoro had promised were about to begin, and the crowd of instructors and cadets gathered in the observation deck only heightened the tension. The training grounds were an intimidating sight, sprawling across miles of artificial terrain designed to mimic the harshest environments the galaxy had to offer. Jagged cliffs loomed in one corner, while in another, swirling pools of quicksand glimmered ominously under simulated sunlight. The air was thick with humidity, a deliberate setting chosen to test endurance. Massive machines moved in the distance, reshaping the terrain to ensure no test was ever the same. David inhaled deeply, trying to steady his nerves. The armor hummed faintly, as if responding to his anxiety. He could feel its presence, not just as a physical shell, but as something more, a guiding force that seemed to connect with his thoughts. He didn't fully understand how it worked, but he sensed it wasn't just a tool. It was alive in some way, observing, adapting, and perhaps even protecting him. General Zoroth's voice boomed across the training grounds, amplified by the intercom system. "Cadet Carter, you are about to face the first trial, the obstacle gauntlet. This test is designed to push your physical and mental limits. You will encounter unpredictable hazards, and your goal is to reach the beacon at the far end of the course. Success will demonstrate that the armor's choice was not a fluke. Failure," Zoroth paused for effect, his tone cold, "will prove otherwise." David glanced at the shimmering beacon in the distance. It was barely visible through the dense fog that rolled across the grounds. He squared his shoulders, his hands tightening into fists. The crowd was silent now, their anticipation palpable. "Begin," Zoroth barked. The ground beneath David's feet shifted suddenly, catching him off guard. He stumbled but quickly regained his footing as the terrain morphed into a series of uneven platforms, each tilting precariously with every step. He leapt from one to the next, the armor amplifying his movements with precision and speed. He could feel its mechanisms working in harmony with his body, adjusting his balance and enhancing his reflexes. It was as if the armor anticipated his intentions before he fully committed to them. A burst of heat to his left snapped him out of his thoughts. One of the platforms erupted in flames, forcing him to change direction mid-leap. He landed hard on a slanted surface, sliding toward the edge before the armor's stabilizers kicked in, anchoring him in place. The crowd let out a collective gasp as he narrowly avoided falling into the lava pit that had opened below. The gauntlet didn't let up. Automated drones appeared from hidden alcoves, firing beams of energy that crackled through the air. David ducked and weaved, his movements fluid and instinctive. The armor's targeting system highlighted the drones in his peripheral vision, calculating their trajectories and feeding the information directly to his brain. He felt a strange sense of clarity, as if time itself had slowed. With a surge of confidence, he sprinted forward, dodging the beams with a grace that surprised even himself. As he approached the midpoint of the course, the terrain shifted again. The ground split apart, revealing a chasm filled with swirling quicksand. A series of swinging pendulums, each tipped with razor-sharp blades, hung above the gap. David hesitated for a fraction of a second, calculating his options. The armorer's AI chimed in, its voice calm and steady. He nodded, more to himself than the armor, and broke into a run. The first pendulum swung toward him, its blade gleaming menacingly. He dropped into a slide, narrowly avoiding the arc of its swing. The second pendulum came faster, forcing him to leap into the air. The armor's propulsion system activated, giving him just enough lift to clear the obstacle. He landed on the edge of the chasm, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Without thinking, he rolled forward, barely escaping the collapse. The crowd erupted in cheers and gasps, their disbelief slowly giving way to awe. Even General Zoroth, watching from the observation deck, couldn't hide the flicker of surprise that crossed his face. David didn't have time to celebrate. The final stretch of the gauntlet loomed ahead, and it was the most daunting yet. A wall of solid rock rose before him, impossibly high and slick with moisture. Embedded in the surface were dozens of shifting handholds, each retracting and reappearing in unpredictable patterns. At the top, the beacon shimmered faintly, a reminder of his goal. He approached the wall cautiously, his mind racing. Climbing it seemed nearly impossible, but retreat wasn't an option. The armor's AI spoke again, its tone encouraging. "Engage magnetic systems, focus on rhythm." David nodded, activating the armor's magnetic grips. His gloves and boots clung to the surface with surprising strength, allowing him to begin his ascent. The wall shifted constantly, the handholds disappearing just as he reached for them. He gritted his teeth, his muscles straining as he adjusted to the rapid changes. The crowd watched in tense silence, their eyes fixed on his every move. Halfway up, a section of the wall began to crumble, sending jagged rocks tumbling toward him. David pressed himself flat against the surface, the armor absorbing the impact as debris rained down. He resumed climbing, his determination outweighing his exhaustion. The beacon was so close now, its light almost within reach. With one final push, he pulled himself over the edge and collapsed onto the platform. The beacon's glow enveloped him, signaling the end of the trial. The crowd erupted into applause, their skepticism replaced by genuine admiration. David lay there for a moment, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. The armor's voice broke the silence, its tone almost proud. "Trial complete. The bearer demonstrates adaptability and resilience." General Zoroth stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Impressive," he admitted grudgingly. "But this is only the beginning. The true test of worthiness lies ahead." David met the general's gaze, his exhaustion fading as a spark of determination flared within him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he felt ready to face it. The armor had chosen him, and now he would prove that its choice was not a mistake. The adrenaline from completing the obstacle gauntlet hadn't fully faded as David stood before General Zoroth in the vast briefing chamber. The room was a stark contrast to the chaos of the training grounds. Its smooth metallic walls gleamed under the artificial light, and holographic displays floated in the air, projecting star maps and tactical diagrams. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the systems that powered the academy. David's breathing had steadied, but the weight of what lay ahead loomed over him like a storm cloud. General Zoroth, ever imposing, folded his arms across his chest and studied David with an intensity that felt like a laser drill piercing through him. "You've proven you can survive the physical trials," Zoroth began, his voice as cold and measured as the room itself. "But survival alone is not enough. Leadership demands more. Strategy, insight, and the ability to think beyond your own limitations." David nodded, though he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had barely recovered from the last trial, and now he was being thrust into another challenge, one that seemed even more daunting. The general gestured toward a floating hologram that materialized in the center of the room. It depicted a barren, lifeless planet orbiting a dying star. The terrain was jagged and treacherous, with violent storms sweeping across the surface. "This is Dorok 7, Zoroth explained. "A desolate world on the fringes of the galaxy. You will lead a simulated rescue mission to extract a stranded team of researchers. The terrain is unstable, the atmosphere toxic, and time is limited. You will be given a squad of drones to assist you, but their functionality will be limited to what you can command. Every decision you make will determine the outcome." David's heart sank as he studied the hologram. The sheer complexity of the mission was overwhelming. He had no formal experience leading a team, let alone one in such hostile conditions. His training at the academy had been focused on individual skills, not command. "And if I fail?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Zoroth's expression hardened. "Failure is not an option, Cadet Carter. Not for you, not for the armor." He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "The galaxy will not forgive weakness. Prove that you are more than a mistake." Before David could respond, the hologram shifted, and the room around him transformed. The walls dissolved into a vivid simulation of Dorok 7's surface, complete with howling winds and jagged rock formations. The air tasted metallic, though he knew it wasn't real. His squad of drones, small spherical machines with hovering capabilities, materialized around him, their glowing eyes scanning their surroundings for threats. The armor's AI spoke softly in his mind, its voice calm and steady. Mission parameters uploaded. Prioritize efficiency. Maintain team cohesion. David took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. He scanned the terrain, identifying the most stable path toward the researchers' last known location. Drones, form a perimeter, he commanded, his voice firm despite the nervous energy coursing through him. The drones complied instantly, moving into a defensive formation as they advanced. The terrain was even more unforgiving than it had appeared in the hologram. Razor-sharp rocks jutted out at odd angles, and the ground shifted unpredictably underfoot. Each step felt like a gamble, the unstable surface threatening to collapse into hidden chasms below. David's armor adapted seamlessly, its stabilizers compensating for the uneven ground. As they pressed forward, the winds intensified, carrying with them a thick, corrosive mist that obscured their vision. David activated the armor's environmental filters, but even then, the visibility was minimal. He relied on the drone's sensors to guide them, trusting their data over his own eyes. The AI provided constant updates highlighting potential hazards and offering tactical suggestions. Obstacle ahead, the AI warned, marking a massive fissure in the ground that stretched across their path. The gap was too wide to jump, and the jagged edges made climbing risky. David frowned, searching for an alternative route. The drones hovered near the edge, scanning for a solution. One of the drones beeped, projecting a holographic map that showed a narrow ledge winding around the fissure. It was risky, but it was their best option. David directed the drones to scout the path ahead while he carefully made his way onto the ledge. The wind howled louder, threatening to throw him off balance, but the armor's magnetic grips held firm. Halfway across, a tremor shook the ground, and a section of the ledge crumbled beneath one of the drones. It plummeted into the abyss, its glowing eye flickering out as it disappeared into the darkness. David felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't anticipated the instability of the ledge. The loss of the drone wasn't catastrophic, but it was a reminder of the stakes. They reached the other side of the fissure, the terrain leveling out slightly as they approached the researchers' last known coordinates. The AI flagged a signal ahead, a faint distress beacon barely cutting through the interference of the storm. David quickened his pace, the drones flanking him in a protective formation. The beacon led them to a narrow cave entrance, its opening partially blocked by debris. Inside, the researchers were huddled together, their faces pale and gaunt. Their environmental suits were battered, and one of them appeared to be unconscious. Relief flickered across their faces as they saw David and his drones. "Are you here to rescue us?" one of the researchers asked, their voice trembling. David nodded, motioning for the drones to assist. "We're getting you out of here. Stay close and follow my lead." The journey back was even more treacherous than the approach. The storm had intensified and the terrain seemed to shift with every step. One of the researchers stumbled, their suit catching on a jagged rock. David moved to help them, the armor's strength allowing him to lift them with ease. He felt the weight of their lives pressing down on him, every decision he made a potential turning point. As they neared the extraction point, the ground beneath them began to collapse, revealing a cavernous sinkhole. David acted instinctively, directing the drones to form a makeshift bridge with their reinforced bodies. The researchers crossed carefully, their fear palpable, while David held the line, ensuring everyone made it across safely. Finally, they reached the extraction point, a glowing beacon marking the end of the simulation. The researchers and remaining drones disappeared as the hologram dissolved, the training room returning to its pristine state. David stood alone, his chest heaving as the reality of what he had just experienced settled over him. General Zoroth's voice cut through the silence. "You succeeded," he said, his tone begrudgingly respectful. "But do not mistake survival for victory. There is still much to prove." David met the general's gaze, his exhaustion giving way to a quiet resolve. The simulation had pushed him to his limits, but it had also shown him the depths of his own potential. The armor had chosen him for a reason, and he was beginning to understand what that reason might be. As he left the chamber, he felt a flicker of hope, tempered by the knowledge that his journey was far from over. David stood alone in the vast debriefing chamber, the echoes of his heavy footsteps fading into the sterile silence of the room. The weight of the armor pressed down on him, not physically. It had become a seamless extension of his body, but emotionally. Each trial he had faced over the past days seemed to carve deeper into his sense of self. The weight wasn't just the responsibility of proving himself worthy of the armor, but also the realization that his actions now carried implications far beyond the academy. He wasn't simply a cadet anymore, he was something more, and that terrified him. General Zoro entered the room with his usual commanding presence, his piercing eyes scanning David as though searching for cracks in his resolve. Behind him, a group of instructors and high-ranking officers followed, their faces a mix of skepticism and intrigue. This was not a standard debriefing. It was a culmination, a final judgment of what David had become since the armor had chosen him. The general gestured for David to step forward. "Cadet Carter," Zorth began, his voice sharp and unwavering, "you have survived the gauntlet, completed the mission simulation, and demonstrated a capability that no one expected from you, or your species. But surviving is not the same as succeeding. The final trial is not about endurance or strategy. It is about purpose." David frowned, his confusion evident. He had thought the simulated mission was the last test, that his actions there had proven his worth. "Purpose?" he asked, his voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. Zoro's expression hardened. "The armor chose you, not because you are the strongest or the most skilled, but because it saw something in you that it deemed critical to the survival of the galaxy. It is time to understand what that is." He turned to the gathered officers and nodded. "Initiate the final trial." Before David could ask what that meant, the room shifted. The walls dissolved, and once again he found himself in an unfamiliar environment. This time, however, it wasn't a simulation of hostile terrain or an alien battlefield. He stood in the middle of a serene, open plain, under a sky filled with countless stars. The air was calm, and a faint breeze carried the scent of something sweet and earthy. It felt almost too real, as though he had been transported to an entirely different world. The armor's AI spoke softly in his mind. "This is no simulation. The trial is real." David's breath caught as he scanned the horizon. In the distance, he saw figures approaching, alien shapes, humanoid but unmistakably non-human. As they came closer, he recognized them as representatives of various species from across the galaxy. Towering Zorathians, lithe and angular Mershons, the crystalline Lumerians who shimmered under the starlight, and others he couldn't even name. Each carried themselves with an air of authority, their expressions neutral but watchful. They formed a circle around him, their presence both intimidating and oddly comforting. One of the Lumerians, their voice resonating like a musical chord, stepped forward. "Bearer of the armor, do you know why you have been chosen?" David hesitated, his gaze shifting from one alien to the next. I don't," he admitted. "I've been trying to understand, but I still don't know why me." The Lumerian nodded, their crystalline form glinting faintly. "That is why you are here. The final trial is not to prove your strength or your intelligence. It is to reveal the truth of your purpose." The circle parted, and a beam of light descended from the sky, striking the ground a few meters in front of him. The light coalesced into a shimmering, translucent figure, neither human nor alien, but something that seemed to encompass both. Its form shifted constantly, as though it couldn't decide on a single shape. "David Carter," the figure said, its voice echoing as though it came from the stars themselves. "The armor you wear was created not as a weapon but as a guide. For centuries it has remained dormant, waiting for a bearer who could unite the divided. The galaxy stands on the brink of collapse. species turning against one another, alliances breaking, war threatening to consume all. You have been chosen not for what you are, but for what you represent. David's heart pounded in his chest. And what do I represent? Hope, the figure replied simply. The ability to bridge the gaps between worlds, to see beyond the divisions of race, creed, and origin. Humanity's strength is not in its physical might, but in its resilience, its adaptability, and its capacity for empathy. The trials you faced were not tests of your body, but of your heart. Each decision you made reflected the qualities that make you worthy. David felt the weight of the words settle over him. He thought back to the gauntlet, to the mission on Dorak 7, to every moment where he had doubted himself but pushed forward regardless. Each trial had forced him to confront not just external challenges, but his own insecurities, his fears, and his capacity to trust others, even those who doubted him. The figure continued. The galaxy needs a leader who can inspire, who can bring together those who have forgotten what it means to stand united. The armor chose you because it believes you can be that leader. But the choice is not complete. You must decide now. Will you accept this purpose, knowing the weight it carries? David looked down at his hands, encased in the armor that had become an inseparable part of him. He thought of Earth, of humanity's struggles and triumphs, of the countless species he had encountered at the Academy and beyond. He thought of the researchers he had saved, the drones that had fallen, and the way the galaxy seemed to watch his every move. He looked up, meeting the gaze of the figure. "I don't know if I'm ready," he said honestly. "But if the armor believes in me, if you believe in me, then I'll do everything I can." The figure inclined its head, a faint smile flickering across its ever-changing form. "That is all that is required. The rest will come with time." The beam of light faded and the figure disappeared, leaving David alone once more. The alien delegates stepped forward, their expressions softer now, almost approving. One by one they spoke words of encouragement, pledging their support for what lay ahead. Even General Zoroth, who had watched the trial from a distance, offered a grudging nod of respect. As the scene dissolved and the real world returned, David stood in the center of the Academy's main hall, his armor glowing faintly. The gathered crowd erupted into applause, their skepticism finally giving way to belief. For the first time, David felt not the weight of expectation, but the strength of possibility. The armor had chosen him, and now he chose it in return. The galaxy was vast, its challenges immense, but as David took his first steps forward, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. The armor, the Academy, and the galaxy itself were counting on him, and he was ready.